For people unfamiliar with you, please tell us your name and a little bit about your background and really what you've been doing for the last several years.
I'm Kim Allen Williams, and Chief of Cardiology at Rush University, and my career has been academic cardiology, nuclear medicine, and cardiovascular computed tomography. So I sort of think of myself professionally as for decades as a photographer. You take the pictures, you tell the cardiologist and the cardiac surgeon who needs help and how much help and where, and then everything changed. Started looking much more at prevention. I always had a history of hypertension in my family and was interested in trying to improve blood pressure because of all of the things that I would see in my community growing up on the south side of Chicago. And working alongside and inside the Association of Black Cardiologists, a lot of the leadership of ABC was hypertension focused, as well as the rest of cardiovascular disease, ethnic related disparities in outcomes, more heart attacks, more cardiovascular disease burden in the community. And so my career has really been morphed more into over the years, more into advocacy, a little less time spent doing imaging, much more doing prevention and talking about how do we make this better for the variety of patients, and how do we reach the scope of patients that will actually improve healthcare costs in this country. And if I were to plot out the next 20 years of my career, it really would be focused on that. Not that diagnostic imaging isn't important, it is, but it would be nice if we didn't have to take so many pictures because we had actually stopped people from developing the disease that we're now taking pictures of.
Tell me about the more recent meta-analysis of all the best studies that showed a 31% increase in mortality for people who ate a ketogenic diet.
So there's actually several studies. There was one that was the one that you mentioned. And before just talking about ketogenic diet, not everybody understands that there are very much varieties of so-called ketogenic diets. They're also called low carbohydrate diets, okay? And there are many names such as Atkins or paleo or carnivore, and I can go on and on. But the idea is that restricting carbohydrates will change your metabolism a little bit. You will decrease your insulin levels, and as your body is looking for alternative fuels, mostly fat and protein, you will develop ketones. Those ketones can actually change the way your body perceives hunger, and so some people will feel sort of less of an appetite. Bottom line is that people will restrict their calories. And they're restricting the insulin, and insulin is a wonderful way of increasing the absorption of all kinds of nutrients out of the GI tract and then depositing those nutrients into cells. So if you drop insulin levels, more of what you eat ends up unabsorbed, and the stuff that does get absorbed gets less deposited in tissues. So it would seem like it would be a win-win-win-win-win if you were to do this. The problem is doing it's not so much the biochemistry of it, it's the pathology of doing this with animal products, okay? Specifically, when you're doing animal fat, you're getting a lot of saturated fat. And I can't tell you whether saturated fat, which we all fear is the worst of the lot, but there are a whole bunch of candidates for what's worse. One would be cholesterol itself, which we've been working on for years, and when you're eating animal products, you're getting cholesterol, unless you're doing honey, Jell-O, and egg whites. The only 3 animal products that I know of that don't have any cholesterol, okay? So you've got saturated fat and cholesterol. So then the issue is, the more recent research says that there's more to it than that in terms of cardiovascular harm, as well as cancer, stroke, and death, and that would be nitrates, okay? And nitrates are good, and nitrites are good preservatives. They will take a piece of a deceased animal that's cut up for human consumption and is decaying and pretty unattractive looking, and make it look so much better. Make it look like really freshly cut and everything. And so that increasing the shelf life, increasing the appeal, may make it more consumable. That's typical of any processed meat. But the real issue of eating processed meat is that that sort of increases the amount of damage that it does. And so there's much more diabetes, more heart failure, heart attack, stroke, all of it. And so we are very concerned about that aspect of the ketogenic diet if people are going to do it with processed meat. So the next issue would just be red meat itself, or even white meat. So if you're barbecuing it, you're now talking, we started with saturated fat, then went to cholesterol, then the nitrates and nitrites. Then you have to do the BCAAs, the PAHs. What are these? They're polyaromatic hydrocarbons, the HCAs, heterocyclic amines. Those are the things that happen when you take an animal flesh and then you burn it at a high temperature and you char it. Well, it may taste good, but those actually seem to increase cancer rates. And so if you're going to char something, it should be a vegetable, not an animal, to avoid those compounds. We got to keep going. All right. So the next one studied or published in the NIH's AARP study was that it's nitrates, nitrites, and heme iron. We all growing up thinking that in order to have strong bloodstream, that you need iron, and you're going to have to get that from eating an animal product. That if you do it from a vegetable product, it isn't as highly absorbed, and that there are phytates in vegetable products that will stop the absorption of iron. Well, it turns out that vegetable iron, it can be absorbed. Even if it's poorly absorbed, you can get enough from it, and it's reduced iron as opposed to oxidized iron, which is in the red blood cells of an animal. And so that heme iron, as it's called, inside those red blood cells is that oxidation that happens that gets transferred biochemically inside the human system. And so you end up with something that generates plaque because of the reactive oxygen species that are present. Generates plaque and then upsets the plaque. And so, okay, so now you've got saturated fat, cholesterol, nitrates, nitrites, heme iron. The list goes on. So probably at the top of the list nowadays is a compound called TMAO, trimethylamine N oxide. Trimethylamine N oxide is generated when you eat animal products that are high in choline, phosphatidylcholine, beta-ene, getting transcribed in your gut by bacteria into trimethylamine, which you then oxidize in your liver to trimethylamine N oxide. Well, that TMAO for short is associated with heart attack, stroke, death, and heart failure. Wasn't for those four things, it would be great. But it turns out that people who eat a plant-based diet have a much lower level of TMAO, and you could actually take a person who is on a plant-based diet chronically or long-term, feed them a steak, okay, and their TMAO level will not go up because it requires the bacteria that are common in the omnivores, the meat eaters, in order to make the trimethylamine. So we've now got a wide variety, and it doesn't really stop there. There are, people are concerned about the phosphorus levels of animals versus vegetables, concerned about a compound that's studied a lot at Rush University, Emory, Mass General, called SUPAR. That's soluble urokinase plasminogen activator receptor. That seems to correlate very well with development of cardiovascular disease and kidney disease, and seems to be responsive to diet. That is, a more healthy vegetable type of diet has lower levels of SUPAR. So there's so many reasons. I wish I could rank order them for you to say why people should be staying away from animal products and eating more on the vegetable side to preserve kidneys, brains, hearts, minds, and lives. And I would think that over the next few years, you're going to hear much more about that. You're going to have some of these tests, such as SUPAR and TMAO, become commonplace so that everybody can get their blood tested and know where they stand, or just don't eat those things and know that you're going to be doing pretty well.
Tell us about Gary Fraser's study about the Adventist health studies.
So Gary Fraser, a wonderful investigator, blessed with a community of people who are willing to submit highly accurate food frequency questionnaires and admit what they're doing with their lifestyle. And that Adventist Church has been advocating for lifestyle improvement for the American population of it. And it has a fair amount of African Americans who have such a high burden of cardiovascular disease. They ask people to do an ovo-lacto vegetarian diet. That's including dairy and eggs, and yet there are people who do a completely plant-based diet, people who decide that they're going to eat fish. There are people who eat a regular American diet, and then people who sort of straddle the fence, so-called semi-vegetarian. So Dr. Fraser actually has 5 different groups that he can study and compare outcomes. And where do we start with the insights that he's developed? I would say number one in my mind, being a practitioner in inner city Chicago, is the dramatic effect that improving along that spectrum of diet, moving toward the plant-based diet, away from the standard American diet, can dramatically decrease the risk factors of the African American population. Not everybody knows it, but 49% of all African Americans, essentially half of all African American adults, have some form of cardiovascular disease. It is largely related to lifestyle, diet, and exercise. And if we could just fix the diet aspect of it, Gary Fraser's data says you're going to see over a fairly short period of time dramatic improvement in weight, decrease in diabetes, improvement in cholesterol, improvement in hypertension. Long term, that should be lives. That's brains. That's functional ability to go to work every day. Having that kind of improvement on our society and our community would be tremendous. So I really applaud Gary Fraser for pursuing all of this. Then he's got a lot more data, such as, for example, if I just hit 2 or 3 highlights, it would be that if you compare those 5 diets, the only one that doesn't have, the only group that doesn't have a body mass index more than 25, meaning they're overweight on average, is the completely plant-based vegan diet. The incidence of diabetes, extremely low in that group. Incidence of hypertension, very low. But, those are just risk factors. How about hard events, heart attack, stroke, and death? So they are getting to the point where they have enough data to publish on mortality statistics, and they do show that particularly in men, you get about a 30% reduction in cardiac events and mortality. Lastly, the picture that comes up now in my brain when having talked to Gary, and I wish I could just go back out there to Loma Linda and congratulate him again in person, just because there's you can actually find it on the internet, a publication that looks at the age incidence of each of those 5 diets. And you could see the standard American diet just decreasing over the decades, okay? And the plant-based diet increasing over the decades. And when you get to the 70 to 80 decade, the 2 of them are almost the same. You would think that if you got to 80 and 90, they would be the same. based on sort of plotting out the trend. What does that really mean? It means that more people are going plant-based as they get older, and they're dying less. And that's why the two curves are going in completely different directions.
Tell us about the REGARD study showing the African American diet is deadly.
REGARDS is an incredible group of investigators who are really dedicated to reducing stroke and looking at all the risk factors for stroke so that they can be addressed. And working on that starting off in the stroke belt of the United States in the South, they identified pretty early that there were dietary components. And they actually also had sort of 5 diets that were really sort of taking nutrition questionnaires and grouping them. And there wasn't, because this is general population in the South, there wasn't a lot of plant-based diet, but they do have what they call a plant-based diet, which is actually a diet that just has more vegetables than the usual, okay? Then they have one, well, the person drinks a lot of alcohol. But the one that was the most damaging was the so-called Southern diet. That is a lot of organ meats, and putting fat back in your greens, and not just yams, but candied yams. So there's a lot of sugar, a lot of sweet tea, fried foods. And if you do all of that, it increases your stroke rate by 30%. If you have kidney disease, it increases your cardiovascular death rate by 50%. Increases your cardiovascular disease overall mortality by 56%. It's all about the diet. And so it was really good to have a data set that's that robust because they're able to really hone in on what it is that we shouldn't be eating. And hopefully everyone will take notice and stick with it. If you add up sort of the two and looking at the African American population, no question that we could pretty much eliminate the cardiovascular ethnic disparity in disease and death if we fix the diet.
And yet, throughout the inner cities and so many other places, all is available is crap.
It's interesting that the United States has congressional money for fast food industry, essentially supporting specific products like high fructose corn syrup and production. And there are actually products, fast food products, snack products, that are made predominantly with federally subsidized dollars. That makes them very inexpensive to sell, high profit margin. And they tend to be in the inner cities. And if you give your typical inner city 14-year-old a choice between a dessert and a sausage pizza versus fresh fruits and vegetables, they're always going to be picking the wrong things. They learn it from the parents, they learn it from the schools. We've had difficulty on the South Side that's been recognized and well talked about in churches, where there's a lot of unhealthy food in churches, and there's so many people who are addressing that now. We're addressing it at Rush University with our prevention program and working with churches, many of whom have already started trying to clean up what goes on. They say that culture beats strategy all day, and that is a really good example. That is, if we don't change the culture and have it be commonplace, then we're going to continue to promulgate unhealthy diet. Hard to talk about that without talking about the origin. And for the African American population, the origin of what you eat, you learn it from your parents, you learn it from their parents, you learn it from their parents. You go back just a few generations, my maternal great-grandmother was born in slavery in the South. And the emancipation happened when she was about 3 or 4 years old. But what was ingrained in her was basically slave food. And people have talked specifically about, why don't we get rid of the slave food? Well, what is it? Well, it's the pieces of the animal that wasn't desired by the people who could afford more. And so anything that was going to be thrown out. And so you see people eating small bowel called chitlins, okay? Well, that is not the kind of food that you would like to see people eating. Very high fat content, a lot of saturated fat. But it was inexpensive. In fact, it was free because it was going to be thrown away. Then you switch to and you combine that with the federal subsidies that we have that make rapidly absorbed carbohydrates and fried food less expensive. Then the people who have any kind of economic depression are going to gravitate towards those foods. So one of the things that we could do to break the cycle is education. And the other thing that we could do is stop the federal subsidies and make those dessert snack foods more expensive. That actually has been shown in terms of sweetened beverages, that if you tax them, it decreases their consumption. Many people think that that's unfair, that people should have a choice. My own personal, I have respect for both sides. I was absolutely thrilled in Chicago when the law was passed saying that there would be more Cook County taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages. I was hoping not that we would collect more taxes, but that we'd have less people drinking those sorts of things, because we know that that would decrease the incidence of diabetes. If I had to pick out just one disease from recent literature, and I'm not sure that people voting were aware of the literature because it was relatively recent, saying that if you do one sugar-sweetened or low-calorie sweetened beverage, one per day, it increases your risk of diabetes by 20%. That's a big burden to put, and many people are doing much more than one per day. So we have a situation where we are feeding our population the kinds of food that are going to make them ill. We pay for the production of things that are going to make them ill, and then worry on the other side, how are we going to pay for health care? Well, a lot of it has to do with prevention. Let's start at the beginning and incentivize people to eat and drink the things that are going to keep them healthy and save our Medicare system. So I've said it publicly many times in response to the Medicare trustees saying that the Medicare system is going to be bankrupt in 2026, that it's everyone's patriotic duty to pay into the Medicare system and then don't use any of it. And how do you do that? Completely plant-based nutrition, exercise every day. Make sure that all your risk factors are controlled or addressed and that you're not overweight. If you do that, we will save the Medicare system.
Walter Willett at Harvard has the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professional Follow-Up Study. What do these studies say, and why are they so convincing?
So first of all, I'd like to spend a moment congratulating them. Walter Willett, Frank Hugh, Dr. Song, everyone who has been working in that area. They've provided a massive amount of data. They are heavily criticized by the other side. You wouldn't imagine that there would be another side, but there is another side who doesn't believe that nutrition questionnaires can be used for fruitful science. The criticisms are that you're going to get some random responses, people who just don't fill them out carefully, people who don't have good recall, 24-hour recall of what they've eaten or what their patterns are, or they're just no good at understanding, what kind of food they're actually eating, and they're putting, random responses. And I have a few criticisms of those criticisms. Number one is that they're doctors and nurses. If they've been to school, they are medically trained, even though they may not be nutrition experts, they know the difference between a steak and a vegetable. For example, all right? The other one is just a scientific or statistical principle of entropy. What in the world am I talking about entropy? Well, that's the third law of thermodynamics, that things tend to disorder, okay? That is, you have to actively expend energy to get something to be organized. So how does that apply here? Suppose you're doing food frequency questionnaires, okay? And there's random responses. How could those somehow coagulate to give you solid information that reaches statistical significance rather than suppressing some finding? Well, fact is that they do reach statistical significance on several major findings. So quoting mostly from the Song article published in the Journal of the American Medical Association a couple years ago, where they found that substituting vegetable protein for animal protein would decrease mortality, cardiovascular, cancer, other total mortality, and that the type of animal protein that you're substituting the vegetables for actually mattered. The biggest highlights would be that if you got rid of processed meat, you would decrease cancer. If you got rid of eggs, you would decrease cancer mortality. If the biggest correlate with cardiovascular mortality was the processed red meat. And that data is so strong that if you look at overall mortality, or heart disease, for example, it appears that you could cut the heart attack rate. And it's hard to imagine a vegan person saying this out loud, but you could cut the heart attack rate in the United States maybe 25% if you got everyone who's eating processed meat to eat red meat instead. Okay? And so very powerful data, and maybe we shouldn't be extrapolating from it, but and probably the one legitimate concern about the levels of difference that you're seeing is that these were doctors and nurses who had at least one cardiovascular risk factor. There may actually be people, whose risk is so low that they could eat whatever they want and not get heart disease. And then there are people on the other side who, if they don't stick to plant-based nutrition, they'll have a heart attack in their early 40s. Well, for most people with a cardiovascular risk factor, they need to pay attention to the nurse's health study and health professional follow-up, where they indicate exactly what will happen to you if you don't substitute all of your animals for vegetables. There's more insight than that that came from their group. Probably one of the best studies that I've seen would be the one in the Journal of the American Medical Association that looked specifically at the levels of things that nutritionally end up correlating with death. Okay, and can people eat some red meat and avoid the increment in death? According to their data, apparently you could. Now, it doesn't say about how well you do in terms of hypertension and the like, but anything over 14 grams, now that's a tiny little piece of an animal product, would result in death or more death. That's unprocessed. If it was processed meat, and it's interesting, the manuscripts that high processed meat, well, it turns out that the definition of high was any, okay? The other one that had any was sugar-sweetened beverages, okay? People should not be eating them at all. Sodium more than 2,000 milligrams, eating saturated fat, all of them ended up increasing mortality. Not having enough nuts, not enough vegetables, enough fruits, increasing mortality. So it's interesting that they're so creative in terms of how to collect the data, and once they collect it, very rigorous scientifically in analyzing it. And you could say that because it's prospective, meaning you start from the beginning, then measure what happens down the road. Non-randomized, which means that you're not telling people what to do. you're just observing, so it's observational, not randomized, that it can only be considered descriptive. It's describing something, not prescriptive. That is, you shouldn't change your behavior based on this. Well, I think that might be a little harsh. I'm not going to see their data, see the nurses and doctors die if they're eating processed meat, and then go eat it. I'm not going to do that. And there are people who choose to say that that's a criticism. And that criticism, the only way to deal with it is prospective randomized trials. And hopefully we will get to that point where we have that kind of level of evidence, but until then, large scale, large cohorts, carefully done with long-term outcomes is pretty much where we are.
Tell us about the study that says there are no safe animal products.
So bottom line is, according to the Nurses' Health Study and Health Professional Follow-Up, as published in 2016 in the Journal of American Medical Association, if you have a cardiovascular risk factor, there are no safe animal products for your consumption.
Who's making the dietary recommendations for the United States, and are they doing what's best for us in the industry?
It's an interesting process that every 5 years, first of all, I should applaud the every 5 years. That is, enough happens in the nutrition area and in the science realm that pretty much everything that was from 5 years ago ought to be rethought. And so it does make sense to go back and look at things. The U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services actually get together and they sort of alternate who takes the lead. But every 5 years, a new set of dietary recommendations are made. It's a nomination process, and the selection process, I'm not exactly sure. I know I've been nominated before. Whether I get selected at some point, I don't know. But they try to put together experts. My limitation as an expert is that I'm really not much of a foodie. All I know is what you shouldn't eat to have heart disease death. That's what I have studied a tremendous amount of. The rest of it, and if they want that kind of input on the committee, I can summarize that literature really well. But there will be people who are nutritionists, dietitians, physicians, people who are really into every aspect, hopefully, of nutrition. Where the problems have been is with any guideline committee, there's always the specter of conflict of interest and financial motivation. And I would say that's one of the reasons that the American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association, we have gone a long way for our prevention guidelines to ensure that we don't have anything like that. And we ask, it hasn't been perfect, okay, who is? But we have asked anyone who's involved in our prevention guidelines to have no relationships with industry or conflicts of interest financially 12 months before the deliberations start, throughout the deliberations, all the way through publication, and then 12 months after. Okay? That's a high bar. That bar has not been reached by the government folks so far, but we're hoping that we will. Now, people will argue the other side and say, no conflict, no interest. Okay? And I can understand that. That is, the people who are experts are usually working in the field, and sometimes they're working with an industry partner who has something to gain by a recommendation. But if you have, for one concrete example, was the concern about cholesterol, about egg consumption. If you're going to make a recommendation on that, it probably shouldn't have people who are affiliated with the egg board making that recommendation, because how can it be objective? And this is an issue. How do you get the expertise on eggs without talking to the egg board? And can you trust what's in the literature? Is the literature funded by commercial entities? And it's always in the fine print, but not all of the relationships with industries are disclosed. I know that this was a big deal, and over here on the East Coast with institutions having investigators who were not disclosing their relationships with industry, and it coming out after the fact. And do you take those articles out of the literature? Well, this is something that we all have to own up to, and we have to be upfront and transparent about our relationships with industry. And when it comes to food, just be, very open about, I'm representing the cattlemen's industry, and I think, red meat can be healthy if you don't process it or whatever. I mean, make your statement and say what your conflict of interest is, and that might be a better process. So hopefully we will get, for 2020, we'll have a new guideline committee, and hopefully there'll be more emphasis on the kinds of studies that we've known in the last 5 years, particularly about health and nutrition from large observational prospective cohorts, and that kind of protective nutrition research will actually get into the guidelines, I hope.
Do eggs increase our chances of diabetes?
So it's interesting that there are specific studies that are quoted saying the opposite, that eggs can protect from diabetes. And then there probably the most widely quoted article, which was actually quoted in the 2015 Dietary Guidelines, the initial report, where it says that having eggs, if you compare two groups of people who have at least one egg per day versus those who have 0 to 1 per week, okay, that if you compare those two groups, you don't see any short-term cardiovascular effects. But I really do want my patients to live more than 3 or 5 years, so I kind of would be interested more in the long-term effects. And if you look at that meta-analysis of large studies that had 0 to 1 versus at least 7 a week, okay, what you saw was a 49% increase in the development of diabetes, and you saw a 69% increase in heart attack or cardiovascular disease in the people who had diabetes. So that would say, yes, eggs are associated with development of diabetes, and if you get it, or if you have it already, you should avoid it because it's going to increase your heart disease. Now, the problem with that, and the reason that you can get such wide variation in diabetes, heart attack, stroke, mortality, and between eggs or not eggs, and even the serum cholesterol. Does the cholesterol go up when you eat eggs? The reason that you can get a variety of answers is it totally depends on how the study is done. So if you take the average American eating 2 eggs and 3 strips of bacon for breakfast, and you take them and you say, I'm going to get rid of the eggs. You're going to get rid of the eggs and you're going to replace it with something. If you replace it with pancakes and butter, you're probably actually going to worsen the outcome, because it turns out that refined flour, in every study, the refined flour actually is worse than eating animal products, okay? Sugar, worse than eating animal products. So you'd have to know exactly what people are doing when they cut those eggs, okay? So you'd actually have to, it's hard to do it observationally. You have to do it prospectively and say, here, you've been eating this, and now you're going to eat this minus blank, whatever that is, okay? But if you remove the bacon, will they substitute, sausage? Well, they're both processed meat. You could remove the bacon and then come to the conclusion that removing bacon made no difference in the cardiovascular disease. Well, it's because they substituted with something that was equally bad. And this, you could say the same thing about the eggs. That is, when you reduce the eggs, are you just going to eat more bacon? And now you've added not just cholesterol, but a larger amount of saturated fat. And so, making the argument that the components that go into bacon are terrible, but the components that go into eggs look actually really good, a lot of protein, a lot of omega-3s and things that should, in theory, be good for you. Well, you'd have to get that data from randomized trials. And if you're concerned about the consumption of animal protein and IGF-1 causing diabetes and cancer, you'd have to be really circumspect about using eggs until you had really long-term prospective randomized trials, not the short-term. There are plenty of those, and they'll say, "Oh, the cholesterol doesn't go down or doesn't go up." Well, that has to do with absorption of cholesterol, and you can saturate the cholesterol absorption with a fair amount of cholesterol, and so if you go from modest amounts of cholesterol to large, you will see an increase in serum cholesterol, but not very much. If you go to none to large, you'll see a dramatic increase. And same in reverse. If you cut down on your cholesterol consumption, you may not see a change in your cholesterol. If you eliminate cholesterol consumption, you see a big decrease, and 30 to 50% decrease in your LDL cholesterol. And so the articles that say diet doesn't matter, they're probably taking those 2 eggs with that would be about 230 milligrams of cholesterol per egg yolk. You do 2 of them, that's 460 milligrams of cholesterol, and then replacing that with more bacon, because I got to eat something. And when you do that, you don't see a change in cholesterol because the bacon has both cholesterol and saturated fat. So we need to be very careful in how the research is done and then how it's interpreted. And the interpretation has a lot to do with how it's done.
What impact does a whole food plant-based diet have on blood pressure?
So hypertension really is a major focus for us because of the expenditures in the United States and now around the world on this disease and its consequences. Okay? And if you add up not just the kidney failure and dialysis and stroke, but just hospitalization for heart failure and outpatient visits and medications for high blood pressure, it is such an economic burden for our Medicare system, because it happens more and more as people get older. And if you look carefully at what we're spending, if we could fix one thing that would fix the healthcare budget, it would be hypertension. So what is the effect of whole food plant-based diet on it? We've had large prospective randomized trials that have looked at this. And if you believe the INTERMAP studies, Jeremiah Stamler at Northwestern led a lot of that. It's actually a specific amino acid in grains, whole grains, and that amino acid is glutamic acid. If you're eating a lot of those whole grains, you will see a drop in blood pressure, and the drop in blood pressure is very much related to the amount of glutamic acid in the diet. So we should all be eating more vegetables. We should all be eating specifically grains to keep the blood pressure low. And so now, that's a good mechanism of how it can improve things. The other side of it is people doing a whole food plant-based diet have the benefit of not having the negatives of eating animal products, the saturated fat, the cholesterol, the salt that's in the bacon, and the like. And so it's sort of a double-edged sword. It's improving things on the one side, and it's getting rid of things that are very damaging on the other.
What's happening to our healthcare system, and what will happen if nothing changes? How will we afford to pay for everyone's medical care?
So healthcare financing is a major issue for me. I talk about it incessantly, being a Medicare advisor on the Ambulatory Payment Classification, HOPS, Hospital Outpatient Prospective Payment System Committee. for 4 years. I learned a lot about them, and I learned a lot about our system, and I have really strong feelings about how we should go about fixing it. There are plenty of countries who don't expend as much money as we do in the United States on healthcare and have better outcomes. If you look at the graphs of where we fall, the quality of the care, not the quality of the care, the quality of the outcomes of the care, okay, versus the expenditure, we're way out of line with everyone else in the world. So I want to make that distinction. Quality of the care is the best. Why do those people who look better on the graph, why do they come to the United States for care? Because they know that the care is good. So why are our outcomes not so good? It's the people, okay? And it's the lifestyle of the people. And we are fighting an uphill battle where prevention is thought of after the fact, if at all. So you look at the number of people who, after a heart attack, where Medicare will pay for cardiac rehabilitation, who are actually referred, apparently it's less than 50% of the eligible people. And so we're not thinking about it for peripheral artery disease, we're not thinking about it for heart failure, bypass surgery, stenting. We should be thinking about cardiac rehab for everyone as secondary prevention. But how about primary prevention? Why not say, I coined the phrase, instead of doing cardiac rehabilitation, why don't we do cardiac prehabilitation, okay? Let's do it before they have an event. You can talk about exercise a lot, but it's probably, the big experts will estimate it at 80-20 or 4-1. That is, the nutrition is 4 times more important than the exercise. Well, if that's the case, we have laws in the state of Illinois about seatbelt wearing. Why don't we have laws about, unhealthy foods? Now, you could say that, and I am a good friend of Cass Sunstein, who's one of the authors of Nudge, that whole idea that, the society does have the right and the responsibility to put things in place like seatbelt laws or, driving 55 miles an hour in expressways in cities and the like, that we do things for the greater good of society, even though they interject their way into our personal freedom. Well, the question is, how far do you go with that? And I think how far you have to go with it is whether or not the system's imploding. And when we were having too many deaths from drunk driving, we make drunk driving laws. And, seat belts have really dramatically decreased motor vehicle accident deaths. Well, how about changing the laws for healthier nutrition? Put them in schools, put them in hospitals, put them in all public places, incentivize the price breaks for eating healthy foods, and increase the price of unhealthy foods. If we do all of that, we will save the Medicare system.
The media often reports that alcohol in moderation is part of a healthy diet. What do you think about alcohol's impact on our health?
I was really relieved at the European Society of Cardiology last August when a large analysis said that alcohol doesn't matter, it doesn't help. That whole concept of a J-shaped curve, that myself as a non-drinker had a higher cardiovascular death rate than the people who drink a modest amount. So I was relieved because I try to do everything that I can to reduce cardiovascular mortality. And I just don't do alcohol well. I know there are plenty of people who can, but I'm just not one of them. And so the data has always been, that's sort of a real phenomenon of research, that if you ask the French, it's got to be red wine and it's got to be from Bordeaux, and if it's coming from another country, it doesn't count. So is it the resveratrol, okay, in grapes that they have a different quantity? No one ever has figured that part out. The so-called French paradox, eating relatively high-fat food and having a relatively low cardiovascular mortality. A lot of cigarette smoking in France, but they seem to be doing pretty well. Well, you could plug a lot of holes in that. When I'm there, I see a lot of cardiovascular disease. The hospitals are very active. The people are more active. And so there are a lot of elements of lifestyle that bring the alcohol portion into question. It may actually help some groups, but if a person is living a healthy lifestyle, it's probably not the most important thing or one of the biggest things that one can or should do. Nothing wrong with alcohol in small amounts for the heart. There are people who develop alcoholic cardiomyopathy with large amounts. They probably should stay away from it completely.
Some people say beans and grains didn't exist until 10,000 years ago and therefore are not our natural foods and our bodies aren't programmed to eat them, and therefore we're actually meant to eat animal products. What does the best science have to say about this?
I'd say the best science would be looking at hard outcomes. People who eat grains and beans live longer than people who eat animals. If you look at the theories that people have come up with, 10,000 years of this, or paleo that, or lectins and beans, we actually want to see the data and look at hard outcomes: heart attack, stroke, death, heart failure. And if you don't have that kind of data, it's hard to have real credibility around it. And the data shows that people who are eating grains and beans, fruits and nuts, actually do better, substantially better. The one exception would be eating fish as part of a Mediterranean diet. Wonderful, prospective, randomized trials, often labeled the diet of the year or something like that. I think that was this past year. The problem with it is that if you look at those, just put it in your search engine, PredaMed trial. If you look at it, you find that only that 30% reduction in cardiovascular events and death was actually only a reduction in stroke. Heart attacks were not reduced substantially, and death was not reduced. And yet that's the number one diet. So my good friends who have worked on that, Dr. Rios, Dr. Estruck, who have collected this data carefully, and I may not agree with eating animals, but I certainly agree with the methodology. I know they had some issues with randomization and they had to reanalyze and republish. I'm glad they republished because it got in front of people again how to do a study, which I think it's a model of. But without an improvement in death rate, no mortality benefit, that makes you question the entire thing, because it was against a pretty high fat control diet and it didn't actually decrease in death. Now, if your goal was to decrease stroke, which I think is a wonderful goal, it does work. So I would say, for the people who are eating beans, greens, leafy vegetables, all of them part of a normal, healthy vegetarian diet, those people are doing substantially better. And that was a sidelight of this prospective trial. That publication came out about 4 years ago from the PredaMed people. They reanalyzed for mortality benefit. How many vegetables are you eating, which is also a marker for how little animals you're eating, okay? Because people can only eat so much, and when they eat a larger percentage of vegetables, they're eating less animals. And they divided their group into 5 groups based on how much vegetables they were eating. And it turns out the last 2 groups, the one with the highest and the next to highest, those 2 actually had a lower mortality. It was a dramatic reduction in death. Inside the Mediterranean diet, if you did a vegetarian Mediterranean diet, or I think people are nicknaming it the Vegematarian, okay, instead of Mediterranean. If you do a pro-vegetarian Mediterranean diet, you actually decrease death. So how can somebody say that these lectins and beans and the like are not good for you based on a theory about 10,000 years ago. Well, people have been eating beans for quite a long time, ever since they were able to cook, because you really can't eat them raw. It's not going to work. And they are a wonderful source of carbohydrate, protein, and even, like soybean fat. The effects are very clear that people who are eating them in outcome studies do better than people who don't. So I would challenge anyone who has a theory like the lectin thing, do a prospective randomized trial. We know how to do it. Predimed taught us how to do it. Do a prospective randomized trial, see what happens, 5, 10 years, and then we can have a good conversation. Until then, no data, certainly not going to get away from what we've learned so far.
Are hemp, flax, and olive oils good for us to eat? Should we try to include these oils in our diet, or should we try to avoid them entirely?
You're mentioning things that have a fair amount of oil in them, and that is a concern to some people in the vegetarian world, that you should eat no oils because it hurts endothelial function. But then you have people who say that you shouldn't eat things that have oils because the fat you eat is the fat you wear. I think both of those have some truth to them. What I don't have is randomized trials of taking a no-fat versus a low-fat vegan diet. I know they're both very helpful. I know people will lose weight and have the weight loss be sustained by doing this. And what I would look for even there, same answer as before, you want randomized trials. And so, if you could take all of these named diets, Furman, McDougall, Esselstyn, Ornish, and do randomized trials between them, that would be really spectacular, and we can answer questions like that. However, we have, I started to say, bigger fish to fry, but probably not what I really want to say, okay? Because of the, it's mercury, saturated fat, the PCBs, polychlorobiphenyls. So let's not fry the fish. As it turns out, if you compare any of those plant-based diets with a non-plant-based diet, they're going to do substantially better. And so doing the comparison among them, answering the differences between them, I'd like to know out of curiosity. I'm not so sure I need to know for my patients, because they all save lives. Why? Because there's no animals.
Do you eat a 100% plant-based diet? And if so, for how long have you been doing it?
So I haven't knowingly eaten a milligram of cholesterol since 2003, when I found out that my LDL cholesterol had climbed. It's not that interesting a story. It's really fairly typical. People don't realize that with age, slowing metabolism, the LDL cholesterol tends to rise. And so they're always surprised, oh, my cholesterol's higher than it was. I haven't done anything different. Yeah, you did. You lived. Okay. And so, but that particular timing for me was a big life change. That is, I had sort of stopped, went from being a tennis professional to being a coach when my kids were coming up. And one of my kids, my youngest son, was really good, really big, really strong, great fastball, great curveball, could play all 9 positions, but he was an amazing tennis player. A couple of national titles in doubles, and was highly ranked in singles. And I was his coach, and that meant that I was playing tennis essentially twice a day. We'd purposely take off Monday if he won the tournament on the previous Sunday. Well, what happens to junior tennis players? They grow up, they age out. In his case, he ended up playing Division I baseball for Valparaiso because, the two-sport athlete, they became too difficult in high school, where he was highly successful his freshman year, getting to late into the state tennis and being called up in between matches to pitch for the baseball team. So as it turns out, poor dad is back to work instead of doing high-level athletics all the time. And over a 2-year period, my LDL cholesterol crept up from the LDL of about 115 to 170. Now, if I left that there, that would have been a short, probably a very short bad term outcome. And so when I measured that at the American College of Cardiology meeting in 2003, fortunately that month, the David Jenkins portfolio diet came out March of that year in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And so my AMA membership paid off because I saw the article, and I had stopped eating animals completely, started eating more plants, sterols, actually was taking the psyllium fiber and the like, and within 6 weeks my LDL cholesterol was down to 90. And so it stayed pretty much in that range. I'm always interested in prospective randomized trials of plant-based things that will lower your cholesterol, such as the psyllium, such as the plant sterols. The newest thing that I've heard from people and looked at it, and sure enough, there's trial evidence, would be Indian gooseberry and Brazil nuts. And yeah, I think we're gonna get more and more data like this, where plants can specifically lower cholesterol. Why are we so interested in that? The correlation between LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular events and mortality is very intense and very linear. And so how low would I like my LDL to go? Probably about 10, okay? And people will argue about that, saying that, in the past we actually thought that there was sort of a lower limit. If you get your LDL below 40, something bad will happen. Well, we got it below 40 and seem to be doing okay. So, well, 25, because you never go below 25. Well, what'll happen if it goes below 25? Your immune system won't work. You won't have wound healing. Your brain is all cholesterol, and so your brain won't work, and the myelin sheaths around your nerves will come apart. None of that was true, not one bit of it. It turns out that, and we learned this from the PCSK9 story, which is worth talking about if people aren't familiar with it. There were people in the Dallas Heart Study who were found to have LDL of 7 or 10 or 14. They seem to be doing just fine, and business people, aerobics instructors, that sort of thing. And they had this extremely low cholesterol, and genetically, which is part of the Dallas Heart Study, is to do the genome, they had a mutation in the PCSK9 gene. PCSK9 is a molecule that's responsible for telling the liver's LDL receptors to quit. That gets taken in by the liver and chewed up and swallowed. And if you don't tell them to quit, then they keep taking LDL out of the bloodstream, and it gets very low. Well, these people don't have cardiovascular disease, number one, and they don't have neurologic or wound healing or any of the other things that we thought. So a whole science group has grown up around reproducing that for the common folks who don't have that mutation. And that right now the leading products are antibodies that will immobilize your PCSK9, and you inject it under the skin twice a month and your cholesterol goes plummeting. The early trials do show significant improvement in outcome, heart attack, stroke, and death. And that is now an option, particularly for people with the genes where the PCSK9 is overworking, or the LDL is receptors are underworking, so-called familial hyperlipidemia. So we have some solutions that can really dramatically improve the outcomes in people. I would say, though, what we've learned is that there probably is no lower limit of LDL cholesterol below which people don't do even better. And we may not be able to eliminate cardiovascular disease by lowering cholesterol, but we can certainly put a big dent of it. We don't have to be number one.
What's the importance for you of the Real Truth About Health conference?
I think the Real Truth About Health conference is getting in front of people, a large number of people. There's an audience here, and according to my friends who are texting me, there are people online. And my best friends in Arizona, actually, they showed me a picture of their dog, who really likes me, looking at me on the screen, giving the lecture. It's a broad audience. It's impacting a lot of people. Why is that so important to me? Well, I'll tell the story tomorrow, but last year was pretty special. It's when the century turned 18 years old. It's now an adult. You have a president who is in trouble every day. You have Russia fighting with over the Crimea with the Ukraine. You had the Boston Red Sox running away with the American League and destroying their opponent in the World Series. And if you haven't figured it out, I'm talking about 1918. Okay, that president was Woodrow Wilson. And what's significant about 1918, for me as a cardiovascular practitioner, is that it was the last year that in the United States, heart disease wasn't the leading killer of Americans. It was knocked out for that 1 year by the Spanish flu epidemic. Spanish flu epidemic lasted 3 years, but by 1919, heart disease was number one again, okay? It's been there ever since. How do we stop it? When are we going to get to number two? That was my career goal, so stated when I took over as president of the American College of Cardiology. I want to be number two. It doesn't look like it's going to happen. The obesity epidemic, diabetes following it, is increasing mortality again. So after 4 decades of steady decline, almost a 70% reduction, a lot of it attributed to what we do in cardiology, better recognition, door-to-balloon times, putting in stents, bypasses, doing defibrillators, you name it, we did it. Death rates went down. Now they're going up again. And you really, as hard as we work in cardiology, the population really can outstrip our ability to protect the population. Yeah, how? Nutrition, okay? The lousy nutrition that people are eating. And if we put together conferences that can impact and inform people of what they're doing to themselves and their poor future cardiologists, okay? Maybe we have a chance. Maybe we can get to number two before I'm done. So that's why I think the real truth in health is so important. Reach that broad audience, make an impact, save their lives, save their families, save their neighborhoods, the entire community, and save our country.